Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and on today's Gear Curiosities, we're taking a look at my first big boy combo amp and what just might be the single most hated line of amplifiers in the entire history of Marshall amplification, the MG250DFX. This is a 2x12 combo version of the MG series, which is, like I said, kind of it has a reputation. We'll say that for right now. And I received this amp as a gift in the Christmas of 2007, I believe. So I've had this for just a little over a decade. And this is kind of the amp I graduated into after having, you know, the crappy blackface combo amp that comes with every like Squire Epiphone starter kit type packages, and this is, you know, what I played on for a long time as my main source of loudness, though a lot of the tones weren't necessarily generated by this, but we'll get into my history of how I used it. So as a brief high-level history lesson, before the MG series came this line of amps called Valve State, and it's a really interesting amp technology because it actually carries over to a lot of the smaller lunchbox heads we see today. That line definitely had its announcers, just like the MG series does, but it had some famous users, and as a result, they command a pretty decent price on the used market because of that, as well as their increasing rarities. So stuff like the bi-chorus especially goes for a pretty penny compared to most heads that are like it. So you got users like Chuck Schuldiner of Death. You had the first couple of albums and EPs recorded by Meshuggah use the Valve State series as well. I think Friedrich Thorndahl even mixed it with some Mesa Boogie heads on Special Defects. So definitely some cool metal tones, although it was certainly helped out by some other high quality gear to get that. But regardless, what's interesting about the Valve State is, as the name would kind of suggest, it actually marries valve or tube technology with solid state amplifier technology, although they weren't terribly intrinsically connected, because the Valve State uses a single preamp tube in the preamp section, much like a lot of these smaller lunchbox heads where you see one or two preamp tubes and then a solid state power section. And it's supposed to bring a little bit more warmth and life and all the sounds that guitarists like out of tube heads, and something that's a little more accessible, both in terms of space and economics. Soon after the turn of the millennium, though, the Valve States were replaced by the MG series, much to the disappointment of Valve State fans, and can't really blame them for reasons that you will soon see here. So to introduce this amp in particular, like I said, this is the 2x12 combo version. You could get the MG series in heads. They might still even be selling them. I've actually not looked. You can get them in separate cabinets with these kind of bottom of the barrel Celestion type speakers. At least one good thing about this combo, and among the features that actually drew me to this amp when I was looking to upgrade, was that it actually had real 2x12 speakers coming from something with like an 8-inch speaker. You can't get a real rock guitar sound out of an 8-inch speaker. It's just not going to happen. You get some decent clean, some cool twangy breakup stuff in 8 and 10-inch speakers, but if you want to sound like the iconic rock guitar tones that we all know and love, you got to have something with 12s. And these are okay, barely. And they certainly did their job, but of course, if you compare it to something with, you know, creambacks or a V30, then they get absolutely destroyed. But you can't expect too much, especially around the 2005 to 2007 time period that I was looking at this amp, for it to have a whole lot better than that. What is really cool about this is that, in conjunction with being a 2x12, it's actually stereo. And you can see that on the back of the amp. So the name would imply that this is a 250 watt amp. It's not. It's two 50 watt amps. And yes, the ace detectives among you are correct. The D in DFX does stand for digital effects. So you do have a selection of stereo effects in the post section, including delay, chorus, flanger, and reverb. Reverb is its own single knob thing. You've got effects level for the other selections there, and you can kind of choose intensity and, you know, time and all that based on the position of here. It's not like you get to deep dive into the parameters. It's like a Line 6 pod where you pick it and you set the effects level and you're done, which, you know, it's kind of a good thing if you just want to jam, but you're getting more or less different iterations of the same sound, which, you know, worked for me. And it was a selling point for this amp because I didn't want a digital modeling amp. I was not impressed with the sounds at that time, at least the in-the-room sounds. I wasn't really all that into recording, didn't even know how to do that yet, so I didn't care at all about how it sounded on a record. And having some post effects was nice for someone that doesn't have a collection of pedals or stomp boxes to achieve that kind of stuff. Which makes the next thing kind of curious, because it is a stereo power amp, because it does have stereo effects. This also has a stereo effects loop, which is a head scratcher to me. It makes sense in one way because you've already got all this other stuff set up in stereo. It's awesome to have a stereo effects loop. But at the same time, at a $500 price point, the people buying this amp aren't going to have stereo effects to plug it in, more than likely. The only thing I could really rationalize that being useful for is if you grow into like a amp modeler stomp box type thing, like a Line 6 floor pod or stuff from Digitech or Boss at the time, and it does have stereo outs. You can use this basically as a powered cabinet. And I have done that to some success, although most of the time I ran stuff in front of this amp and just used the post, since you could turn it on and off with a foot switch. So it was a cool decision to throw a stereo effects loop on there, but not really all that useful for most people that are actually buying that. It's just one of those mismatched selling points. Probably they mainly did it to put it as a bullet point in their marketing materials. The other thing is this does have an aux in. Unfortunately, it is a 1/4 inch, so if you were rocking an iPod or a Zune, remember those things, then you would have to buy a 1/4 inch adapter to fit your 3.5mm jack into it. Kind of a missed opportunity there. I think most like little plug and play amps actually have 3.5mm now, so that's been rectified, but that's pretty much what you can do from the back, which wasn't bad. Like a pretty good suite of features for a combo amp of that price, especially at the time. So turning to the front of the amp and switching the power on, you're greeted with this lovely sound. So some tube-based amps are cooled by a fan. My Mesa Mark IV has like a 100 to 120 mil fan. I don't know. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it's at a low enough RPM and it's large enough that it's not all that distracting. With this thing though, it's just small enough and just high RPM enough to be a pain in the ass if you're playing in a bedroom situation. If you're playing with a band and rehearsing or something, you're far enough away from it. Really not that big of a deal, but it gets annoying after a while, hence why I had this turned off. Next to the power switch, we have an emulated line out, which is possibly the biggest lie about this amp. This is what caused a lot of people, including myself, to hate the idea of emulated line out on amplifiers. And basically what this is a tap off of the power amp at a low volume. So you do still get your post effects, and it's nice because you can just plug headphones in. Unfortunately, it sounds like ass because this is just throwing an EQ curve after the raw amp sound to emulate the EQ curve of a speaker, but it doesn't sound like a speaker at all, compared to an impulse response or even some other more decent emulated lines out that were on even earlier amps in the 90s. This thing it does not sound good, so I never used it. I thought that would be a cool feature, and I did plug headphones in it for the first couple of weeks I owned this amp, and I just thought, God, this has no life. It's terrible. And then once I started reading up about it, I quickly understood why. So kind of useless for me. Next to that is even more marketing gimmick. This is the FDD full digital something, I don't know. As far as I can tell, this is a loudness button. A lot of contemporary home stereos and car radios have a button that does something similar to this, and they're generally labeled loud or full or some bullshit like that. And basically what they are is a counteracted Fletcher-Munson curve, where we tend to hear mid frequencies more subdued as you turn the power up of a particular amplifier or whatever. And that's just because the way our ears are sensitive to 2000, 3000 hertz range, is kind of the vocal range. So if you listen to something, even if it's EQ'd completely flat at a lower volume, it's going to sound more mid-range and kind of weak. But as you turn it up, it's going to sound fuller, and you don't get that as much. And basically what that is to make it sound louder at lower volume levels. They're using some digital post-processing, and if you play by yourself, it does sound better. If you're using the aux in for playing along to music, it does sound better at practice volumes. As you turn it up, if you're playing with even just a drummer, it sounds hissy and terrible. So, you know, this was basically a bedroom only button for me, and we'll certainly show what that sounds like. A cool addition, I think, but it's certainly another one of those features like the emulated lines out that makes you think this doesn't belong anywhere. Moving on to the preamp section, I'm turning off this power because that's driving me insane. Starting with the clean channel. This is among one of the most clean channels I've ever played. Even on stuff like the Roland Jazz Chorus, you can at least push the gain high enough where if you got like a high output enough guitar, you'll start to get some solid state breakup in there, some op amp clipping diode sounds. It's still super clean. This thing, they should have relabeled gain to volume. Like, it does nothing in terms of breakup the further you push it. And it really is kind of useless for anything that, you know, if you're trying to emulate Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix or anyone that had kind of that edge of breakup thing that sounds good with tube amps. You're not getting it out of this. But for completely clean material, this channel works really well. So well, in fact, I use this amp exclusively for stuff like my high school jazz band, and then threw on like a drive pedal for leads and solos. Worked wonderfully. No breakup, didn't matter how loud you crank the master volume or the gain, you're getting that one clean tone, which is not a bad thing. The other really great thing about this clean channel is that it accepts pedals wonderfully. And that's what I used pretty much exclusively for stuff like Digitech distortion pedals, Boss distortion pedals, to get a more high gain sound. And I found that these EQ controls kind of behave more like a hi-fi system than something, you know, like a traditional Marshall tone stack or even like a Fender Vox. I'm sure the tone stack is more EQ'd to behave with just a straight guitar signal, but it works a lot better than even some tube clean channels for accepting you know, the kinds of distortion pedals you might want to use. Of course, you lack the tube dynamics that a clean tube preamp will give something like a solid state or digital stomp box, but it still worked fairly well, and because of that, I use that channel all the time for boosting stuff. And the good part is the gain is literally your volume, and there's no real interaction in terms of distortions to another distortion. So for me, the clean channel worked great. But if you need anything other than those couple of applications, it ain't. You're going to need some sort of stomp box to get a tube breakup type of sound. So let's discuss the atrocity that everyone's actually watching this video for. The Overdrive channel. Oh boy. So the Valve State series was popular among heavy metal enthusiasts, among even some popular bands in their early years and even some in their heyday, for its articulation, its tight low end, being able to take high output pickups or even boosts, overdrives, and turning it into a chug machine. Something that, its gain structure really didn't sound all that Marshall to most people. The EQ curve kind of set in the mix like a Marshall would, but it had its own distinctive character, and that's what made it popular and what made it sound good. And you pair it with some decent speakers and some good cabinets, and you've got a really iconic guitar sound that is still sought after by a lot of people. Now take all those positive synonyms I just said and throw them into thesaurus.com, look for the antonyms, and that'll pretty much describe the Overdrive channel on the MG series. It's not good at all. So what I wanted out of this channel was to be able to take the gain and dial it back here and crank the mids and a little bit of treble and take down the bass and kind of get the old school plexi sound, kind of get a Black Sabbath, AC/DC, Jimi Hendrix style overdriven Marshall super lead. Then I wanted to be able to take it about there and get in Van Halen territory and throw an overdrive in front of it and sound like Randy Rhoads. And then want to be able to crank it and absolutely obliterate the mids and sound like Megadeth or Metallica. And that just really doesn't happen on this amp in the least. With everything else set at noon, this is kind of what the gain does. Basically nothing, extremely weak, still anemic, almost a rock guitar sound, but still weak sauce. Starting to get there, but now we're losing any form of articulation. Flubby, still too low gain, max flub, and it's still not enough. You have to boost this thing to get anything resembling a Zakk Wylde or a Metallica guitar tone. And even without a boost, it's not articulate enough like the Valve States or any of these positive qualities that you get out of a high gain tube amp. They're just not here. It's an extremely flat sounding channel. In fact, it's so flat, I would bet you can run the effects send out of this amp into a tube amp and it would sound fine. It would sound like a Marshall distortion pedal in front of it. With the tone stack, bass is way too bassy to be a Marshall amp, but it works for what I used it for, and you can certainly dial it back. The contour shows back up from the Valve State series instead of a mids, and it kind of does the opposite of what mids do. So the more you crank it, the less mids you get, the more scooped. And I'm assuming this is just some sort of high Q band pass that is tanking or raising that spectrum of frequencies. You really want to keep it around noon or less, in my experience, if you want to get a guitar tone that anyone can hear in a live playback scenario. And then treble, it never gets too harsh, but it doesn't really do the Marshall thing where you can crank treble and mids and bass all the way to minimum and get a classic sound. It's just not going to happen. At least though, this does have its own dedicated volume, so you can balance it all out and it'll work okay with the master volume. With this disappointing gain structure and overall flat sounding overdrive channel, it's really no wonder that this amp as a whole was panned by critics as well as consumers. And you don't really see it all that much under Equipboard for artists that use this piece of gear all that often either. There is one artist that I know of that used the Marshall MG series, and that was Wayne Static of Static X, rest in peace. And I don't know what he did to get those sounds on record. You can tell it's a solid state amp, but this don't sound like it. He did use better speakers. He used combinations of T75s and V30s, but even plugging into those cabinets that I have those speakers, it just ain't doing it. So he must have had some extremely high output pickups and a shit ton of post EQ. But then again, Static X wasn't exactly known for a wonderful guitar tone. It's just kind of one of those, you know, generic distortion, nu metal industrial things where every down pick is just a brat, brat, sonic assault at your ears. So if you want anything resembling clarity for single note passages or the brutals, then you're not getting it with this Overdrive channel. As a result, to sound anywhere on, you know, the same planet as Zakk Wylde or James Hetfield's Marshall sounds, or hell, even Tony Iommi, I ended up using this Wylde Overdrive all the time with this channel. It didn't fix the dynamics problem, but at least made the guitar tighter. So, you know, you've already thrown down $500 for this amp. This I wouldn't recommend at the time, but you can get like a Boss Super Overdrive that, as we've discussed before, is the identical circuit to this with a couple tweaks. So you could, you know, get those sounds more or less on the cheap and still stick with mostly analog gear. Finally, that brings us back around to the digital effects, and as I hinted at earlier, they're actually not bad. The reverb doesn't really sound like any one type of reverb. It's like a mishmash of room and hall and cathedral and whatever. It's definitely not a spring, I can tell you that. And it does kind of get overbearing in the high frequencies past around 10 to noon, I find, especially if you've got this bullshit digital boost thing engaged. But it works, and as someone that just needed some simple post reverb for especially clean stuff, it worked really well. Unfortunately, it's not engaged via foot switch, which is really unfortunate, though you can with the other effects. The delay is not bad. All of these are kind of similar in sound to, you know, other earlier digital modeling devices like Line 6 pods or their you know, independent effects and Korg and whatever. They work. And then chorus is not really the kind of dimension sound I like, but it's also not that flangery chorus that I don't like either. So definitely functional, and you can make it really overbearing with cranking up the effects level or keep it subtle, and you get a nice stereo image, which I really liked. And then flanger, I think it's over there. Yeah, flanger, it's pretty good. I didn't use it a whole lot, but if you're going for a Van Halen, you know, kind of sound, you can get it there. And you can also do chorus delay combined. So I use that one a lot. You can, you know, foot switch it on and off. Though if you wanted to change exactly what effect you were using, say mid set list, or if you're jamming with a band, you're walking your ass back over here and turning it manually. I did that a lot. So in the year 2019, or any year, you might be watching this video unless it's before the video came out and you broke the space-time continuum, then you should probably be doing something better with that power. But can I recommend the MG250DFX or the MG series as a whole to anyone? Not really, would be the answer to that question. Especially in today's market where you've got stuff like the Boss Katana, that's a thing, and that just absolutely destroys pretty much any competing technology that does a sort of solid state solid state power section with digital effects. It just sounds so much better than this amp, and I would have killed to have had a Boss Katana growing up. But even used in the $150 to $200 range, you just get so much more for your money, both in direct applications as well as just getting something that is more focused. That's the thing. This thing just has no focus. Nothing about it is standout. There are individual little features. It's like, oh, that's cool, like the stereo effects loop, some okay digital effects, but unremarkable amp channels, definitely unremarkable speakers, and as a whole, the construction just really isn't all that great. You don't get a amazing resonating sound out of it, and it's flat. It's a flat, solid state kind of sound. So no, I really can't recommend this. With that said, I don't really regret nor blame myself for picking this amp out 10, 11, 12 years ago. Of course, if I had my way, I'd love to have stereo JCM 2000 rigs and all the stomp boxes I wanted in the world, but that wasn't going to happen. So for the price bracket, there really wasn't a whole lot of good competition. I hated the sounds of the Line 6 Spiders at the time, even if they were a similar price point. A lot of the other solid state stuff I was equally unimpressed with. And at least this thing was stereo and had a lot of good features to grow into, even if they were a little disjointed. And ultimately, that made me experiment. That made me throw digital modeling technology in front of this to get some different sounds. And it made me discover, oh, I really like the dual rectifier and 5150 sounds. I think maybe I want to go towards that. Or, hey, I really like this whole concept of digital direct modeling anyway. Why do I even need this amp for a lot of the stuff I'm doing? So in all of its inadequacies, it actually not only made me better in terms of being able to dial in good tones, but in terms of knowing what I even wanted to begin with. So because of that, because of the value I hold in terms of playing with it for so long, I can't sell it. I mean, it's going to stay around even if I don't play it ever again. It's just one of those, it's one of those pillars for me that I grew up on, and played a lot of stuff and learned a lot of stuff on this amplifier. So if anything, I hope you learned from this that it doesn't really matter, especially when you're starting out, what you pick. Everything is going to have downfalls. Everything is going to have its positive points as well. So don't overthink it. Trust your gut. Pick something that you can either grow into and add on as you progress, or sell and get a decent amount of money back and invest in something better. Because when you don't even really understand the fine details of recording guitar, or the difference between a diminished scale or a harmonic minor, then there's really no point in sweating too much over how great your guitar tone is. Get something that's functional, and that's what it was for me. Functional, and it was worth the $500, no doubt. Got way more money out of it than that. It just doesn't hold up at all to quality stuff that we look at normally on here, but still fun little nostalgic trip for me. So I hope you enjoyed that episode of Gear Curiosities. Questions, comments, as always, leave them down below, and we will see you hopefully sooner rather than later with more obscure or interesting gear like this. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.